Awesome. Thanks, Meg, for the introduction. Alice, I want to pass the mic to you because I know we've got 30 minutes and this is a beautiful conversation to have, especially today. I'm just honored to lead this conversation, but I want to pass the mic to you to give the floor to speak more about yourself, the work that you're doing, and then we'll roll right into these questions that folks have submitted offline.
Thank you so much, Maryella. So I'm Alice Lee again, and I am a staff engineer at Squarespace. I just started last September, so switching jobs in the middle of a pandemic is certainly a tough thing to do. But before that, I've been working in various tech and MarTech companies for the last 13 years. And I'm obviously very talented, very passionate about racial justice and social justice issues. It's definitely something that's been a big theme in my life. So yeah, I'm here to talk about the bamboo ceiling. I'm here to talk about how the model minority myth plays into that. So shall we go straight into that?
Yeah, and I'm sure you're very talented at what you do. So that
sorry
that blurb
that.
No, but you know what? Don't be sorry. And actually, this is one of the things I love about these virtual events is that we see the human behind the camera. And I love that we could start with a bit of humor and just to remember that, you know, we are all in it to win it, and we support everyone here that's speaking today. So Alice, let's start with this first question here. The term the bamboo ceiling was coined in 2005. What does it mean? And how are we seeing it reflected in business and society today?
Yeah, so it was actually Jane Hyun who coined it, so I don't want to take any credit for that. But most of us have heard of, you know, the term the glass ceiling, right? Just to recap for those who might not have, it's a term for this invisible barrier that prevents women from in the workforce from being promoted to leadership and above levels. So it's a very similar concept, the bamboo ceiling, where the idea of diversity for a lot of corporations means that like people of color, Asians are usually hired at entry levels, but they don't tend to get promoted to leadership, management, and above levels. So I just wanted to share a little illustration of this that is kind of a riff on something that I've seen in on social media. So you've probably seen a pyramid like this if you're on Twitter as much as I am. But you can see like if a company, oftentimes when a company says they're committed to diversity, you know, it's usually at the lower levels. Honestly, like at a lot of companies that I've worked for, this is pretty accurate. Statistically, Asian Americans make up actually about a third of the corporate workforce, but only about 14% of Asian Americans actually get promoted to executive roles. So I thought this was pretty interesting in terms of statistics, and I hope you might as well. But yeah, a big reason for that kind of discrepancy, I would point to the model minority myth.
And that's actually a great segue into this next question that folks have submitted offline. I'm going to read through this next question in just a second, but I want to remind our live callers to go ahead and write their questions in the chat box because I do want to try to get to some live questions as well. So if anyone can relate to the image that Alice has just shared on her screen, or if you can't relate and you're curious and learning how you can be an advocate to, you know, promote more, you know, diversity and equality in the leadership roles, like I welcome you to start to write those questions in the chat box. So let's move on to this next question for now, Alice. What is the model minority myth, and how is it used to drive a wedge between Asian Americans and Black and Brown people?
Absolutely, yeah. So you've probably heard of like so-called positive stereotypes about Asian Americans. We're good at math, we're quiet, we're passive. So according to tolerance.org, the model minority myth is, and I quote, it characterizes Asian Americans as a polite, law-abiding group who have achieved a higher level of success than the general population through some combination of innate talent and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, immigrants striving. And, you know, in a lot of Western corporate culture, these traits don't exactly scream like leadership material, because in our culture, it tends to favor like assertiveness, like dominance, and these aren't really qualities that are part of the model minority group. So in terms of how it's been used to drive a wedge between Asians and Black and brown people, we need a little bit of a history lesson here for context.
Bring it on, bring it
Yes.
on. I love this.
Because I don't know about you, but I took AP US history in high school, and the amount of text that they had dedicated to like anything related to Asians was like a paragraph about Japanese internment or like a sentence about Chinese exclusion. So a lot of this is stuff that I had to learn on my own. Not a lot of people know this, but these so-called positive stereotypes are more of a recent thing that started after the civil rights movement. Before that, Asians were stereotyped as being like aggressive, violent, dirty, lazy. And if you ever see any propaganda against Asian Americans in the early 1900s, you'll see a lot of those stereotypes at play in like those political cartoons. They called it the yellow peril. And this was used as a reason to justify Japanese internment or Chinese exclusion. They don't really give that context in history books usually. So, but during the civil rights movement, many Asian American activists even tried to take back this term yellow peril by using slogans like yellow peril supports Black power. So at the time, you know, though Asian Americans were still a small minority because of immigration policies like Chinese exclusion, we were becoming heavily involved in these civil rights movements. There were Asian Black Panthers, actually. There were Asian American activists like Grace Lee Boggs, who was a Chinese American activist in Detroit, which is my hometown. There was a Japanese American activist, Yuri Kochiyama, who worked really closely with Malcolm X. Asian Americans allied with Black and Latinx people to form the Third World Liberation Front against white supremacy. And then the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 actually finally repealed the last of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And, you know, Americans were expecting a wave of immigrants to come in from China. And coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, like the term model minority was first published a year after that. And this phrase brought those new so-called positive stereotypes into the culture to contrast Asian Americans with Black and brown people, you know, to drive that wedge between them. And think of the name itself, like, why is it a model minority? Like, they're using Asian Americans as a group to point to and be like, why aren't you more like that? So it exists to subvert the progress of racial justice for everyone. I mean, especially Black and brown communities. It exists to create that group of people to like drive a wedge in support of white supremacy, and peel away Asian American support for civil rights that we originally supported in the first place. So after those immigration restrictions were lifted, there were huge waves of immigrants from all over Asia over the next few decades, to the point where the new immigrants massively outnumbered the original Asian Americans who were part of that civil rights movement. And why is this important? And it's because a lot of those new immigrants were from places where they were the majority, right? When you're from the majority, you grow up seeing people just like you represented in all walks of life. You're not going to naturally empathize with being a marginalized group. So a lot of these immigrants, and like my own parents actually, they were sold the American dream and this whole idea of coming here for a better life. And when you're American dreaming like that, you're not particularly like woke to the reality of what it means to become a minority in your new country. And that's what happened. They went from majority to becoming minorities, and they don't necessarily understand the implications of that. So, it wasn't even until my 20s that I started learning about the history of Asian American oppression, and I was born here. Like, that's just, that information is just not really freely available, at least not when I was a kid before the internet.
And that's a good point, because the internet today, obviously you can search anything, you can search for anything, but those things aren't necessarily being implemented in our educational systems. I am so aligned with what you're saying. I think it's actually pretty disgusting that we get only the A side of history, as I coin it. I, as a young woman, had to learn more about my history as well. So I feel I identify with the same sentiment that you're saying. So first of all, thanks also for giving us the history lesson. I find that in these times of, needing to find clarity and needing to practice emotional intelligence so that we can practice empathy and self-awareness and social awareness. It does take some digging back into the history books to see, okay, what was I fed and what should I try to highlight a little more so that I can just open my mind and learn more about my community and the communities around me. Let's fast forward to today. So we are unfortunately seeing a wave of anti-Asian hate and violence recently. What can we as individuals and as businesses do to fight this type of discrimination?
Yeah, I'm going to be really open and vulnerable here. Like, as a personal note, remote working has been kind of a godsend to me. I live in New York City. It's actually been a hotspot for a lot of anti-Asian hate, along with the Bay Area, actually. So, like, on the Daily Show a couple weeks ago, Trevor Noah actually said, and I'm going to quote, "There has been an 867% increase in reported hate crimes in New York City alone." And it's especially crazy when you consider the fact that everyone was indoors all year, and people are true a-holes if they're going to risk getting corona to show you how racist they are. Again, that's reported hate crimes. So, like, as we know, a lot of crimes go unreported. So especially if the victim might not be the best at English, or they might be undocumented, too scared to go to the police, don't trust the cops for any reason, So now we can see the so-called model minority stereotype actually is doing nothing to help Asian Americans in this pandemic of not only the virus, but also hate crimes. In fact, like, a lot of times the model minority stereotype is emboldening these attackers, these assailants, right? Because they're choosing victims to attack that might be more vulnerable, more, as they perceive it, submissive or passive, or any other kind of Asian American stereotypes. They're especially targeting women and elderly people lately, which is obviously horrendous. So, and from my personal perspective, even before COVID, I would get racially charged harassment on a pretty regular basis on the street. I've even gotten physically assaulted and called a racial slur on my morning commute once. And that's not something anyone should deal with, especially if they're just trying to get to work. So even for Asian folks who might not have experienced something as extreme as that, there's a huge bystander effect that's coming in from all these stories on their news feeds every day. So I've seen a lot of my Asian friends and colleagues express anxiety about returning to the office, or that they've started paying for expensive Ubers instead of taking public transportation. I even know one person who had to quit her job because she was being harassed on the train, like, constantly, and didn't want to put herself in danger anymore. So if you're an employer, having empathy for folks who are in this position is so crucial. Being understanding and allowing more flexibility in whether or not they return to the office at all, or being more flexible with any kind of remote working arrangement, it would go a long way to helping your employees and colleagues feel like they can hold down a job and stay safe. Otherwise, I would recommend folks to, educate themselves, educate others, speak up, when you see racism and xenophobia, report racist comments you might see online. You know, for Asian Americans, speaking up more in the first place, not only for ourselves, but for, you know, Black and brown communities, that's another way to stave off the model minority stereotypes that's harming all of us, honestly. And of course, I would recommend donating to charities dedicated to fighting these things. I've been donating to this charity called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. They're rated pretty highly on Charity Navigator, and they've been putting out a lot of anti-hate crime material since the start of the pandemic. And some other good charities that I would recommend would include Stop AAPI Hate and Hate is a Virus.
Thank you so much, Alice, for sharing your journey and the unfortunate, you know, situations that your colleagues and your friends have gone through, and also for just giving a really, you know, poignant response on how to deal with that if you're an employer. If you are the person that is receiving that microaggression in the street or online, what can you offer that person to do, you know, who's listening right now, who might, you know, that will provoke anxiety or, you know, self-esteem issues, or maybe even put them in danger? What can that person do on the receiving end?
Oh my gosh, this is something that I still personally struggle with. Like, I've gone through so many different ways of dealing with it. I've tried to ignore it. And then I started to think to myself, well, maybe if I'm ignoring it, that's contributing to these model minority stereotypes. I tried talking back. I've reported it a couple of times. I've gone to I have like reported it to the authorities. But yeah, there are a lot of resources out there for, especially on those sites that I mentioned, Stop AAPI Hate and Hate is a Virus. And they have a lot of materials on setting up like community groups where you can like either volunteer or get someone to accompany you to places to stay safe. You know, I hate to put the onus on folks who might be potentially like experiencing those issues to stop it, but unfortunately at this time, you know, that is the best we can do until you know, there might be more policies in place to officially like condemn these things or anything like that.
So you've mentioned a couple of resources, so thank you for providing that. I want to just give this opportunity to speak to this question here. Feel free to dive in deeper if you can. Are there lessons that the anti-Asian discrimination movement can learn from the Black Lives Matter protests?
Absolutely. So there's a very famous quote that goes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So we might recognize who might have said that. That person gets misquoted and misunderstood a lot, as we might know. So I don't necessarily want to name them, but I just want the truth of that quote to resonate with us without the baggage of whoever might have said that. So the lesson here, I say, is solidarity, right? I think between the events of the BLM protests last year and even to the insurrection earlier this year, it's become really clear that white supremacy is a problem for all of us, right? As a result, we need solidarity more than ever. We need solidarity with people of all races, genders, religions, sexual orientations, like the LGBTQIA and plus, like the whole alphabet mafia, as I like to say. You know, solidarity, right? It's a two-way street. And I would say Asian Americans also need to address a lot of racism and anti-Blackness within our own community. Last summer, I saw so many stories of young Asian Americans having difficult conversations with their family members about the George Floyd situation. I myself had to educate my own mom about it, again, because she's a first-generation immigrant who came here without any clue about racism. And we all need to continue on that path. And again, speaking up not only for ourselves, but for more other marginalized groups, those in the Black and brown communities, again, is another way to bust that model minority myth and get back to the roots of our activism in the civil rights movement among Asian Americans.
Yes, I love that. We need to put that on a t-shirt, and I will wear that all around Argentina and educate folks out here. So let's move. We've got a couple minutes left. I love to move into the workplace a little more. What's one of the biggest misconceptions, and maybe you can speak about microaggressions here as well, that you've experienced as an Asian American woman in tech?
Oh my gosh. Well, a big one is that I come from a background of class privilege. Like when I say I'm from Detroit, people assume I'm from the suburbs, but I actually grew up in Detroit. This is another side effect of the fact that the only types of Asians you see on screen are like the crazy rich ones. But I'm like, well, those Chinese restaurants in the hood, like those little kids that grow up running around it, that was me. But otherwise, as a woman in an industry that is usually overrepresented by men, I've experienced my fair share of microaggressions in that regard. But as we know with unconscious bias, it's very rare when you hear people's misconceptions of you outright. And it's rare these days when people expose those biases in front of you. But like earlier on my career, I had just broken the screen on my smartphone. And it was my first smartphone and I was still really poor. So I didn't want to get a new one. I was at the IT guy's desk asking him if there was anything I could do about it. And there was a sales guy standing by overhearing our conversation about what I can do to fix my screen. And for a little background, it was like an agency type situation where the sales department would work with clients to sell our coding services. I was a senior developer on my team. This particular sales guy always went to my male teammates who were under me for code questions. So this sales guy is scoffing and saying, "Women and tech, am I right?" And the IT guy is like baffled and it's like, Alice is a developer, right? And immediately I see the color drain from his face. And he's like, "I thought you were a copywriter because of all the text on your screen." And suddenly, like, it made sense why he never came to me with code questions. And I'm like, well, no, that's not copywriting. That is code that I'm writing.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, I feel like, when someone is in those situations, I speak with women throughout the week on PowerToFly to share knowledge. What do we do in these situations when just we're faced with ignorance and we're faced with, people that just don't see us, this invisibility matter. It's definitely a tough cookie to chew on, but I thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I would say, how can one not, how can someone be more aware? Let's say this guy who was on the other side who just assumed, right? So this is someone who doesn't even work on your team. Because I find that it has this like big wave trickle effect more often than not when either people don't speak up or when people are kind of sidelined. What's a nice response, or does it vouch, no response needed for those little microaggressions that happen in the workplace and outside of the workplace?
Oh my gosh. Well, I felt pretty lucky that the IT guy I was talking to actually like stood up for me and corrected him. And a lot of times that kind of is what I see happening in the workplace, is that there are allies and you can be an ally yourself and stand up for your colleagues, because oftentimes when microaggressions like that happen, like I was honestly too shocked to really say anything. And you always have this effect where you look back on a situation that happened that was shocking and you're like, oh, I should have said this or I should have said that. But like, honestly, when those emotions come up, like it's like fight, flight, or freeze. And if you're frozen and can't do anything, and if you see your colleagues going through that, like that's when you jump in and that's when you say something. Because as much as we would want, we always have those moments where it's like, oh, I should have said A, B, and C. Like we can't always understand how we would react in the moment,
Yeah, when I started traveling the world, I was like, I need to just get a card. And when I'm in a taxi and someone says this, really aggressive, racist thing to me, like instead of just having to give him a history update and just like let him know how it's totally wrong, I just wanted to give him a card with all the ways that he could educate himself. because so that you don't have to take all of it on your own every time. It can get exhausting. So I love that you have been able to find allies who will speak up with you. So hopefully folks who are listening can do that as well. So we've got a couple minutes left. I do want to talk about COVID, since that is, a very real thing happening right now. What hurdles do Asian Americans specifically face when returning to the workforce after a break to be a caregiver or being forced out of work because of COVID?
Oh my gosh, on top of all these mental health issues that everyone is experiencing because of COVID, like everyone, I mentioned before that there's this additional anxiety that so many Asian Americans are experiencing over fears of being attacked, fear for their friends and family and loved ones, and especially the safety of our elders, because that's really huge recently. It's heartbreaking. And so we have this extra layer of seeing people who could be our relatives targeted for violence every single day. We're experiencing the bystander effect. We're experiencing anxiety and fear. It wears down on your soul. And just speaking for myself, it's been a struggle to be productive with these fears about my safety and the safety of my loved ones weighing down on me. But of course, the model minority stereotype and the bamboo ceiling are still very real things that haven't gone away. Like even if, you're in a situation where you do have empathetic and understanding employers who will let you, travel at whatever rate you feel safe at. Even if we can feel good about returning to work safely, we'll still need to deal with those other hurdles that are in the way of our career progressing. So again, I don't want to necessarily put the onus on Asian Americans to dispel these stereotypes, but because, it feels a little bit victim blamey, but at the same time, like being aware of these stereotypes and aware of how these perceptions might be piled onto us helps us to navigate whatever unconscious biases are out there. And of course, if you're in a position to hire or promote people, being aware of these unconscious biases yourself or among those you work with is even more important.
Thank you so much, Alice, for taking time out of your busy schedule to drop knowledge and to share your personal journey. Also tips and tricks on just how to survive and, bring more balance to the way that we work and the way that we, share this world together. I really appreciate this. Can you remind our live callers where we can find you to support the work that you're doing online and any other tip or trick or food for thought that you want to end this conversation with?
Awesome. Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I post a lot of my updates there, and I'm also on Twitter at Alice Lee Code, and that's AliceLicode. And yeah, any updates I will be posting to those areas.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, Meg, I will pass the mic over to you. And again, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you, PowerToFly, for this experience.
Thank you, Maryella.
So happy to have hosted you. Can we get a round of applause for this amazing chat we just witnessed?